Hey, welcome back to another weekly update. I'm Harje. I just wanted to talk about trade in this week's video and how technology could change trade dynamics going forward. So I know it's kind of a really talked about topic at the moment. You've probably seen it in the news quite a lot, but I wanted to talk today about specifically what technology could do to trade longer term, which I don't think many other people are talking about. So I've actually printed off a couple of articles from Bloomberg. You've probably seen a couple of them. The first one here says, Trump's easy trade war hits snag as China plays the long game. A lot of them are very similar to this one. They're basically just saying Trump thought it would be easy just putting tariffs on China and they would bow quite quickly. However, obviously they're not doing that. Some have even talked about advantages that China might have in this trade war. You've probably seen the rare earths topic come up recently, where China controls almost 80% of rare earth production. They control 90% of rare earth processing and about 80% of the rare earth that the US import, which goes into their military technology or consumer electronics, that also comes from China. So the threat is that China might cut supplies to the US and that could cause trouble. I don't think that is the main problem, though, in this trade war, the main weapon in this trade war. I've said it a couple of times before, I think the main weapon is US dollars. So China needs US dollars and Trump is trying to shunt China of US dollars going into that country. So what does China need US dollars for? They need it to prop up the yuan. So they use dollars to buy yuan so it doesn't devaluate. They also use US dollars as a reserve asset. So with more US dollars, the Chinese banking system has more reserves, and with more reserves, Chinese banks can then lend out more money to their businesses and consumers. So I just wanted to emphasize the point that I think the US has the upper hand in this whole trade war because they control the actual main weapon of this trade war, and that's US dollars. So what I think Trump is trying to remedy with these tariffs is a situation that happened back in 2001. So what happened in 2001 was Bill Clinton tried to encourage the traders of the world to let China into the WTO, the World Trade Organization. By letting them in, China would be able to export their goods to countries like Germany and the US and alike. And also those countries could then export their goods into China and their massive consumer market. And that's how Bill Clinton kind of sold the world on letting China into the WTO. He was essentially saying, oh, US businesses can now export their goods into this massive Chinese consumer market, but obviously that's not what happened. What happened was as soon as China got into the WTO, they did not change their employment or environmental laws. And US businesses then took their businesses or their factories over to China and they started flooding the US market with cheap goods. So to Trump and his supporters, what China has basically done is they've taken not only the manufacturing industry, but they're taking jobs along with it. And those tariffs that Trump is now imposing on China, they're in effect trying to bring back those factories and therefore those jobs. But I think it's important to note that those jobs long-term aren't actually coming back. While the manufacturing industry might come back, the jobs won't come back. And to prove the point, I just want to show you or just want to talk about a couple of stats in this report. This is a report from the US Department of Agriculture, and it just looks at the long-term history of US farming. So in 1900, about 40% of the US population were on the farms, and they were working with about 21.6 million animals. So way back when, the US was largely an agricultural society, but they've since changed. Why is that? Because those animals have been replaced by machinery, and a lot of those farms have become a lot more efficient. I'll put some graphs up on the window here, but essentially this efficiency has increased output, and there's only so much food, so much agriculture that the US population can consume. So a lot of these farmers had to then die off. I think now it's almost 2% maybe of the US population is in farming, and they're kept in business largely by the government through subsidies. Also, globalization had its impact where the US farming industry went from a domestic industry to an international industry. So not only did they have to compete with domestic producers, they also had to then compete with much lower cost international producers. So what happened in agriculture, I think, is going to happen in manufacturing. You're going to have automation and robotics come in. They're going to take people out of the workforce. They're going to increase output to a point where demand for that output is a little bit too high and it's going to get saturated. And then you're going to see manufacturing actually go back to their country of domicile. So if you're a manufacturer and you're seeing this happen, you're seeing the workers getting taken out of the factories. What that means is cheap labor no longer becomes an advantage. And instead of running your operation in China, for example, it costs almost as much to run your operations in Germany or the US. So why not bring back those factories to where the domestic market, where your market is, and save on those transport costs? This is what I think will happen ultimately long term. And you'll see this technological shift, play out through the manufacturing industry and decline global trade, especially for manufactured goods over time. So what does this actually mean? So for the US, they're not probably going to get their jobs back long term, the manufacturing jobs. They might get their industry back. For China, it means that they have to try and get as many people out of the manufacturing industry as quickly as possible and into the service industry, just so that they don't have hundreds of thousands of people unemployed, unskilled, and not spending within their economy. For investors, what you want to try and do is you want to try and look at these local producers now. Hopefully they can be dominant local producers. So I'll put this picture up on the screen as well. This is a picture of a toaster that Mitsubishi made. It's a Japanese toaster. It costs about $390. So I'm definitely not going to buy one. I'm sure many of you probably wouldn't buy one. Even if you wanted to, you couldn't, because they only produce them in Japan and South Korea, because they have a local taste for this kind of toaster. So what this toaster does, it's the latest and greatest in toasters. And what it does is it produces the best slice of toast, perfectly toasted, apparently, the marketing material says. And that's because they have a local taste in Japan and South Korea for toast in the morning. So, for example, they did a recent study in Japan where they had 51% of people now preferring toast with breakfast rather than miso soup or some other traditional type Japanese meal. And that's because over time, they've had a local taste towards these thicker, single sliced pieces of toast. And the point is, goods are going to be customized to local tastes. So for example, goods in Australia might be similar to goods in the US, but they're going to be slightly different because of that customization. And for investors, I think it's important that you recognize what you want to look for is actually these locally dominant producers or these locally dominant service businesses that can dominate a niche industry within that local economy which they're actually operating in. And you can easily see how this would kind of affect the trade dynamics globally. You're going to have less trade going out into the future, especially for manufactured goods. And you're going to see a lot more automation and robotics come into various industries, even the service industry, for example. So that's kind of what I think about what's going to happen with these trade dynamics, even though the trade war rages on. I think this is just the first inkling of what would be a much larger technology shift. So if you liked my video, maybe put a comment below of what you think might happen. Remember to like this video as well and subscribe to our channel. And I hope you enjoyed this week's update. Thanks.